Welcome. You've joined us for another deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're focusing on Mariupol. It's a Ukrainian city now under Russian occupation for, 3 years now?
That's right, 3 years.
But we're not just, skimming the headlines. We've really been digging into a BBC Verify investigation.
A really thorough one.
Yeah, they analyzed documents released by the Russian-installed city authorities. And we're trying to understand something critical, the seizure of Ukrainian homes.
It's a huge issue on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So our mission today in this deep dive is really to unpack the scale of these seizures, how they're actually happening, and what it truly means for the Ukrainians who've lost their properties. We want to go beyond the standard news reports,
Get into the underlying processes, the implications.
Exactly. For you, our listeners.
Right. And when you start examining these official documents, like the BBC Verify team did, what just jumps out immediately is the sheer scale.
How big are we talking?
Well, their analysis, just since July 2024, identified at least 5,700 homes earmarked for seizure.
5,700, that's a lot.
It is. And break that down. About 2,200 are facing what the documents call imminent seizure.
Imminent. So like right now?
Pretty much. And then there's another 3,550 flagged as potentially ownerless.
Okay, potentially ownerless. We'll need to unpack that term.
Yeah.
But first, that number, 5,700. Can we put that in context? What was Mariupol like before the full-scale invasion? Give you a sense of the impact.
Absolutely. Context is key here. Before the war, Mariupol had roughly 425,000 people.
Okay.
And estimates suggest about 350,000 Ukrainians fled after the occupation began, a massive displacement.
Huge numbers.
And you have to remember the destruction during the siege in 2022. It was devastating. Human Rights Watch reported, I think, 93% of the high-rise buildings, that's 443 towers, were damaged or destroyed.
93%, just incredible destruction.
Yeah, and they also estimate over 8,000 deaths, though, they themselves say that's likely an undercount, probably much higher. So you've got this backdrop. Huge displacement, massive destruction, thousands likely killed. And now, thousands more homes are being officially targeted for seizure.
It really paints a picture. You start thinking, with numbers like that, what does the future demographic of Mariupol even look like?
It raises serious questions, definitely.
Now, that term you mentioned, ownerless, it sounds very bureaucratic, very neutral almost.
It does, doesn't it?
But it seems to mask a really serious situation for the actual owners. What are your thoughts on how the authorities are using that term?
Well, that's exactly it. It's fascinating, but also deeply concerning, right? The Russian authorities, they label properties ownerless if they claim, the homes aren't being used, or if there isn't a registered Russian owner.
Ah, a Russian owner, that's the catch.
That's the key part. Because, as the investigation makes clear, these homes do have legal owners. They have Ukrainian owners who were forced to flee, or maybe they're the heirs of people who were killed.
So ownerless is really a fiction, a legal fiction.
You could call it that. It essentially disregards the existing Ukrainian property rights completely.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics then. How does this actually work? Based on those documents, can you sort of walk us through the steps? How does a home go from belonging to a Ukrainian family to being seized by the city, so you can understand the process?
Right. The process, as laid out in these official documents, it typically starts with a report.
A report from who?
It could be local inspectors or even other residents living in the city, neighbors perhaps.
Okay. Someone flags a property. Then what?
Once it's reported, the authorities, the Russian-installed ones, they're supposed to publish an announcement within 10 days, usually on their website.
And this announcement lists the property as
having signs of being ownerless. That's the official phrase. And this listing, this initial step, is really a critical moment for the original owners.
Okay, so let's imagine, your home suddenly pops up on a website listed as potentially ownerless. What happens next for you, the actual owner, who might be hundreds or thousands of miles away?
Yeah, and here's where it gets really, really difficult and, frankly, quite interesting from a bureaucratic standpoint.
How so?
Within 30 days of that online publication, just 30 days, the owner has to physically appear, not just contact them, but appear in Mariupol.
In person. In occupied Mariupol.
Yes, in person. And they need to bring their ownership documents, and this is crucial, a Russian passport.
Wow. A Russian passport.
They do mention they might accept other forms of ID, but the sources, the documents the BBC looked at, don't specify what those could be, so it creates a lot of uncertainty.
A Russian passport requirement. I mean, you can immediately see the massive obstacle that creates for so many Ukrainians, right? People who fled precisely because they didn't want to live under Russian authority.
It's a huge hurdle, an absolutely significant barrier for, well, potentially hundreds of thousands of people.
So what if you can't get back? What if you don't have or won't get a Russian passport in that 30-day window?
Well, if the owner doesn't or can't make that trip back within the 30 days, then the authorities start the formal process. They move to register the property as officially ownerless.
Okay, so it becomes official on their books.
Right. And after that registration, there's another waiting period. 3 months.
3 months for what?
3 months before they can then go to court and seek an order that transfers the home's ownership legally, under their system, to the city.
A court order. And are these decisions, these court rulings, are they public? Can you, as an outside observer or researcher, actually find and review them easily?
Well, that's another issue. The BBC Verify team reported it was very difficult to access, widespread public records of these final court decisions. Things are quite opaque.
But there are some numbers.
There are some. Oleg Morgan, he's the Russian-installed mayor of Mariupol. He did mention at a recent conference, I think he cited around 600 flats that had already gone through that final stage, already seized by the city.
600 confirmed seized, but potentially thousands more in the pipeline. Now, Petro Andrushenko, he used to be an advisor to the legitimate Ukrainian mayor. He had a pretty bleak view on the chances of getting property back once it's on these lists, didn't he?
He did, yes. His assessment, based on what he knows of the situation, was that, practically speaking, once your property ends up on one of these lists, retrieving it becomes, quote, impossible.
Impossible. Even though the installed mayor claims people can appeal.
That's what Andrushenko suggests, that despite those claims about appeals, the reality on the ground makes it impossible. It points to a system where, the deck is really heavily stacked against the original Ukrainian owners.
This whole process, the reporting, the lists, the court orders, it feels very systematic. Does it point to something bigger? How does this fit into the broader picture of what people are calling the Russification of Mariupol, so you can see the context?
Yeah, I think you have to connect it to that broader context. It seems clear these housing seizures aren't happening in a vacuum. They look like a central piece of a much larger, deliberate strategy to, Russify Mariupol.
How so?
Oh.
What else points to that?
Well, alongside the housing seizures, we're also seeing things like the construction of new Russian military facilities inside the city.
Okay.
Streets are being renamed, old Ukrainian names replaced with new ones approved by Moscow. Even the city's coat of arms has been changed. They removed the Ukrainian language elements and added Russian symbols like the imperial eagle.
Wow. So changing the physical landscape, the names, the symbols.
Exactly. Taken all together, it strongly suggests a coordinated attempt to erase the city's Ukrainian identity and really cement a permanent Russian presence and narrative there. The housing seizures fit right into that.
It sounds incredibly difficult, even dangerous, for Ukrainians who fled to even think about trying to reclaim their property. What are the biggest barriers you'd face if you were in their shoes?
Oh, the obstacles are just immense. They're multi-layered. First, just the physical act of returning. You typically have to travel back through Russia to get to occupied Mariupol.
Which isn't safe for many Ukrainians.
Exactly. People attempting that face what are often called filtration camps or checkpoints run by the FSB, the Russian security service. These are described as grueling security checks.
Filtration. That sounds ominous.
It is. Reports say these checks can involve intense interrogations, checking phones, social media, and the process can apparently last up to a week. Intense scrutiny.
A week of interrogation just to try and get back to your own city.
Potentially, yes. And then let's say you even get through that, you're then face to face with all the bureaucratic hurdles we talked about, the tight deadlines, the unclear rules, and immense pressure to accept a Russian passport, which, again, many are just unwilling to do for very valid reasons.
And wasn't there also a specific decree from President Putin that adds another layer of difficulty, making this choice even more impossible for people?
Yes, that's right. In March 2025, Putin signed a decree. This decree essentially bans citizens of what Russia deems unfriendly countries, and Ukraine is definitely on that list from registering property in the occupied territories.
Bans them completely.
Well, it bans them until 2028 unless they get some kind of special permission, which you can imagine might be very hard to get.
So it puts Ukrainians in this terrible bind.
An absolutely impossible situation, really. You're forced to choose between your safety maybe even your national identity by refusing a Russian passport, versus any chance, however slim, of reclaiming your home. It feels like a coercive measure, clearly designed to push people towards accepting Russian citizenship or giving up their property, solidifying control.
Beyond the process and the legality, though, it's the human cost we need to understand. For you listening, these aren't just statistics. The BBC investigation shared some personal stories, didn't they?
They did, and they really bring it home. There was Helena. Her surname wasn't used for her safety, obviously. She fled Mariupol. Her flat was damaged by tank fire during the siege.
Okay.
She later found out somehow that it had been repaired, but someone else was living there, occupied without her permission, without any contact.
Just taken over.
Yes. And now she lives in fear that it will be officially seized through this ownerless process. She called it, very bluntly, legalized stealing of property. It can just feel her distress and anger.
Legalized stealing. That's powerful. And then there was Pavlo's story. He actually stayed in Mariupol.
Yes. Pavlo, also not his real name. For protection he stayed, even after being wounded during the fighting. His experience really highlights the pressure cooker environment for those who remained.
What did he say?
He said he felt he had absolutely no choice but to get a Russian passport. Why? Specifically to prevent his home from being seized under these new rules.
So he took the passport purely out of fear of losing his home.
That's what he indicated. And he added something really telling. He said, 95% of all talks in the city are about property.
95%.
It just underscores how this issue dominates everyday life, the anxiety, the conversations for everyone still living there. It's all consuming.
And Diana Berg's situation, another person mentioned, that highlights a different kind of dilemma, right? For those outside with family still there, perhaps you've followed stories like this in the news.
Exactly. Diana fled Mariupol, but her family home was left behind. She still has a relative living in the city.
Okay, so maybe that relative could try and save the property.
That's the catch-22. For her relative to even attempt to deal with the authorities about the property to prevent seizure, they would likely have to travel out of Mariupol, go through Russia, face that whole filtration ordeal we discussed, and then come back.
Infiltration again.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Diana said there's simply no way her family member could or would undertake that kind of dangerous journey. So it highlights the practical impossibility for many displaced people to protect their property rights, even if they have someone on the ground. It's just not feasible or safe. You can understand the feeling of helplessness.
It really sounds like there's a deliberate lack of clarity around this whole thing. A lot of confusion, maybe even intentional confusion. That must be incredibly unsettling for you as someone just trying to figure out your rights.
That's a really crucial point for you to grasp. The BBC report mentioned looking at Telegram chats, local online groups. They found widespread confusion. People just couldn't understand the rules, why their property was suddenly being declared ownerless.
No clear guidance.
Exactly. And Helena, the woman whose flat was occupied, she captured it perfectly, she said. The rules are not clear and are not published anywhere. And then she added, you can be prosecuted for anything Ukrainian in your phone or in your records they have on you.
Wow. So not just confusion, but active fear.
Yes. That lack of transparency, combined with the constant threat of arbitrary prosecution or punishment, creates this climate of fear and deep uncertainty for everyone living under the occupation.
Switching gears slightly, what about the legality? From an international law perspective, what do experts say about these seizures so you can get a handle on the wider legal context?
Yeah, that's an important angle. Professor Nahal Buddha, he's an expert in international law at Edinburgh University. He was quoted in the BBC piece. His assessment was pretty unequivocal.
What did he say?
He stated that these seizures are a clear violation of the laws of war. Specifically, he pointed to the Fourth Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention.
Okay, the foundational rules for wartime occupation.
Exactly. Rules designed specifically to protect civilians and their property during occupation. Seizing civilian property is prohibited, except in very, very limited military necessity cases, which clearly don't seem to apply here on this scale.
And why are they clear violations in this case?
Professor Buddha emphasized that because these seizures are happening as part of, and stemming from, what international law considers an unlawful annexation of territory, the seizures themselves are therefore illegal under international law, full stop.
So illegal actions based on an illegal premise. You might wonder then, are international bodies looking into this? Are there avenues for accountability down the line?
That's the hope. But accountability is often a long and complex process in these situations, but the legal consensus seems clear.
Finally, let's circle back to the human impact. Thinking about it for you, beyond the legal points, beyond the practical nightmares, what about the psychological toll, the sheer stress and trauma on Ukrainians who've lost their homes or live in constant fear of losing them?
It's immense. Petro Andrushenko, the former mayoral advisor, his quote really hit hard on this. It speaks volumes for you, the listener.
What did he say?
He described the whole process as profoundly distressing and confusing. He said, it's like someone hurt you again and again.
Again and again.
Yeah. He continued, you can't understand how it is possible that your flat, your property are ownerless. It's like being hit on the head with a hammer.
Hit on the head with a hammer. That really conveys the shock, the violation.
It does. It powerfully illustrates that deep sense of violation, the disbelief, the injustice, and the continuous re-traumatization these actions inflict on people who've already suffered unimaginable loss and violence.
Okay, so just to wrap this up for you, what we're seeing here is a systematic, large-scale seizure of Ukrainian homes in occupied Mariupol. It's being done under this bureaucratic label of properties being ownerless.
But the reality is very different.
Right. The process itself is complex, it seems deliberately opaque, and it throws up huge, often insurmountable barriers for the legitimate Ukrainian owners trying to reclaim what's theirs. Things like needing to appear in person, needing a Russian passport.
The filtration checks, the legal decrees.
Exactly. And this isn't random. It appears to be a key tactic and a broader strategy to Russify the city, changing its identity, its demographics, its very character.
And all of this carries not only significant international legal implications, but also just deeply damaging psychological consequences for every single person affected.
Absolutely. As you said, the Russification agenda seems to be a core driver here, aiming to displace Ukrainian identity and cement Russian control over Mariupol. You now have a clearer picture of how that's playing out regarding housing.
It's a multi-pronged approach, and property is clearly central.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Consider what it truly means for individuals, for a whole community, to have their homes, their connection to place, systematically stripped away like this. What are the long-term consequences? Not just for those forced out, but also for those who remain living under this occupation, surrounded by these changes. It's a really sobering thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.